So this fall, the University of Chicago freshmen received a letter from the Dean of Students, John Ellison, in which he affirmed the university's firm commitment to freedom of inquiry and expression in the context of mutual respect and civility, and then went on to say, the quote, "Our commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings. We do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives at odds with their own." So, what are trigger warnings? What are safe spaces? Indeed, what prompted this letter? Have speakers been disinvited, and why? So, and I think most importantly, do these developments pose a threat to the mission of educational institutions? And who better to help us answer these questions and ask many others than Professor Geoffrey Stone. Professor Stone is the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. He's a preeminent First Amendment scholar with publications, awards, and achievements too numerous to take up time here. That's what Google is for. Amazingly, he also finds time for public outreach. I hear him on the media. I hear him on several podcasts that I listen to. And indeed, he's here, and he is here at minimum for the third time. So wonderful. And he also has a unique insight into the University of Chicago letter and this larger controversy. In the letter to incoming freshmen that I referenced at the beginning, Dean Ellison invited the students to read the so-called Stone Report, so named after Professor Stone, who several years ago, I think in 2014, chaired a committee on freedom of expression at the University of Chicago, which produced this influential report. So I welcome Geoffrey Stone.
Thank you, Svetlana. I'm delighted to be back here again. I've enjoyed my prior visits, and this is a topic of obvious interest and importance to universities and indeed to the nation. So to begin with, academic freedom, it's important to understand, is not a law of nature. It does not exist of its own force. It is always vulnerable, and as history teaches, it should never be taken for granted. Indeed, until well into the 19th century, real freedom of thought was neither practiced nor professed in American colleges and universities. To the contrary, any real freedom of inquiry or expression in American colleges was smothered by the dominance of religion and by the prevailing theory of doctrinal moralism, which assumed that the worth of any idea should be judged by what the institution's leaders thought its moral value to be. In the early years of the 19th century, for example, any student or faculty member who argued that fornication should be legal, that homosexuality was not immoral, that women were equal to men, that blacks were equal to whites, or that there might not be a just and all-powerful God who had created man in his own image, could surely be expelled or fired from American colleges without hesitation. Similarly, through the first half of the 19th century, as the nation moved towards civil war, any professor or student in the North who defended slavery, or any professor or student in the South who challenged slavery, could readily be dismissed, disciplined, or expelled. Indeed, when a professor at the University of North Carolina expressed sympathy for the 1856 Republican presidential candidate, students burned him in effigy, and he was dismissed by the university's Board of Trustees. And when a professor at Franklin College in Pennsylvania admitted that he was not an abolitionist, he was promptly fired. Between 1870 and 1900, though, there was a genuine revolution in American higher education. With the battle over Darwinism, new academic goals came to be embraced. For the first time, to criticize as well as to preserve traditional values and understandings became an accepted function of higher education. By 1892, William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago, could boldly assert, when for any reason the administration of a university attempts to dislodge a professor or to punish a student because of his political or religious sentiments, at that moment the institution ceases to be a university. But despite such bold sentiments, the battle for academic freedom has in fact been a contentious and a continuing one. In the closing years of the 19th century, for example, businessmen who had accumulated vast industrial wealth began to support universities on an unprecedented scale. But that support was not without strings. And during this era, professors who offended wealthy trustees by challenging, for example, the ethics of their business practices were routinely dismissed from leading universities, including Cornell and Stanford, merely for criticizing the practices and policies of big business. Then during World War I, when patriotic zealots persecuted and even prosecuted those who questioned the morality of the war, universities collapsed almost completely in their defense of academic freedom. Because such speech was deemed unpatriotic, hateful, and potentially dangerous to the nation, students and professors were systematically expelled or fired at such institutions as Columbia and the University of Virginia, merely for encouraging a spirit of indifference towards the war. Similar issues arose again with a vengeance during the Cold War in the age of McCarthy. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, most universities excluded those suspected even of having sympathies for communism from university life. After all, the advocacy of communist beliefs were thought to undermine the central premises of democracy, to promote moral degeneracy, and to subvert the values of young men and women. At the height of this era, Yale President Charles Seymour went so far as to boast that, quote, "There will be no witch hunts at Yale because there will be no witches. We will neither admit nor hire anyone with communist sympathies." Thus, as history teaches, academic freedom is not to be taken for granted. It is, in fact, a hard-bought acquisition in a centuries-long struggle for the freedom to challenge the accepted wisdom and to seek knowledge, understanding, and truth. History also teaches that every form of orthodoxy that has been imposed on the academy, whether religious, political, patriotic, scientific, moral, or philosophical, has been imposed by groups who were fully convinced of the rightness of their position. But history also teaches that every one of these groups has later come to be viewed by most thoughtful people as inappropriately intolerant, frequently wrong, and invariably destructive of the true mission of the American university. Now, we now face a similar set of challenges. We live today in an era in which students themselves demand censorship, and colleges and universities, afraid to offend their students, too often surrender academic freedom to charges of offense. To give just a few examples, several colleges and universities, including Brown, Johns Hopkins, and Williams, have recently withdrawn speaker invitations because of student objections to the views of the speakers who were invited. Northwestern University recently subjected a professor to a sustained sexual harassment investigation for publishing an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education on sexual harassment investigations at Northwestern. Brandeis University ruled that a professor's classes would henceforth have to be monitored because in one class the professor had explained that Mexican immigrants to the United States are sometimes referred to as wetbacks, to the horror of some of his Mexican-American students. At the University of Kansas, students demanded the termination of a professor for using the word nigger in class during a discussion of campus racism. Colorado College suspended a student for making a joke that mocked feminism. William and Mary at the University of Colorado and the University of California all disciplined students for criticizing their affirmative action programs. Students at Vanderbilt University demanded that a tenured professor should be fired for writing an op-ed in which she raised questions about Islam and violence. The University of Kansas disciplined a professor for mocking the National Rifle Association. Louisiana State University fired a professor after 2 decades of service because some students complained that they'd been made to feel uncomfortable by her use of profanity in class. At Wesleyan University, after the school newspaper published a student op-ed criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement, a group of students demanded that the university should defund the school paper. At Amherst College, students demanded that the administration should remove posters stating that all lives matter. At Emory University, students demanded that the university should punish other students who had chalked Trump in 2016 on the university sidewalks because, in their words, a university is supposed to be a safe place, and this made us feel unsafe. At DePaul University, students shouted down a speaker whose views they opposed, causing the event to be terminated. And at Harvard, African American students demanded that a professor be disciplined for saying in class that he would be lynched if he gave a closed-book exam. Now, the latter is an example of so-called microaggressions, words or phrases that may make students uncomfortable or make them feel unsafe. Saying "off the reservation" has been deemed a microaggression to Native Americans. Saying America is a melting pot has been deemed a microaggression to new immigrants. And saying, "as a woman, I know what you must go through as a racial minority," has been deemed a microaggression to racial minorities. Such microaggressions, whether used by faculty or students, have been deemed punishable by colleges and universities across the land. Indeed, a recent survey revealed that 72% of current college students support disciplinary action against any student or faculty member who expresses views that they deem racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. Another recent invention is the trigger warning. A trigger warning is a requirement that before professors assign readings or hold classes that might make some students feel uncomfortable, they must warn the students in advance that the readings or the class will deal with such sensitive topics as sexual assault, affirmative action, abortion, divorce, murder, slavery, the Holocaust, religion, homosexuality, Donald Trump, or immigration, or might include words that upset students like spick, kike, or fag. The idea is that students who would be upset can then avoid having to deal with such emotionally fraught material. So where did all of this come from? It was not too long ago when college students were demanding the right to free speech. Now they demand the right to be free from speech that they find offensive, upsetting, or emotionally disturbing. What explains this rather profound shift in attitude? One often expressed theory is that some members of this generation of students, unlike their predecessors, have been raised by so-called helicopter parents who protected, rewarded, and celebrated them in every way from the time they were infants. On this theory, these students have never learned to deal effectively with challenge, defeat, uncertainty, insult, or fear. They therefore feel the need to be protected from ideas that they find to be offensive, hurtful, or demeaning. If this is so, then the proper role of the university is not to shield those students from distressing and offensive ideas, but to prepare them for the challenges of the real world. The goal of the university should not be to insulate students from discomfort and insecurity, but to enable them to be strong and effective citizens of the world, a world that will not shield them from such expression. Another explanation of the current phenomenon is that this generation of college students is more attuned than their predecessors to the injustices of society, to the harmful impact of hateful expression, and to the inequities that underlie our nation. On this view of the matter, students today are not timid but bold. They seek not shelter, but equality and justice. Still another explanation is that some students, particularly those who come from disadvantaged, marginalized, and discriminated against backgrounds, have always felt intimidated and unwelcome and out of place. But in the past, they have simply remained silent. On this view of the matter, this generation of college students, particularly those who themselves feel discriminated against and alienated, deserve credit, because instead of remaining silent in the face of oppression, they have the courage to demand respect, equality, and safety. My own view, for what it's worth, is that there is an element of truth in all of these perspectives. But the question is what to do about it. Faced with the ongoing challenge to academic freedom at American universities, as Svetlana mentioned, in 2014, University of Chicago President Robert Zimmer charged a faculty committee with the task of drafting a formal statement for the University of Chicago on freedom of expression. The goal of that committee, which I chaired, was to stake out the University of Chicago's position on these issues. The committee consisted of 7 distinguished faculty members from across the university, and after broad consultation with faculty, administrators, students, and and individuals from other institutions, we produced a brief 3-page report. And at the risk of being self-indulgent, I want to read you some excerpts from that report. This is a quote of excerpts. Because the University of Chicago is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees all members of the university community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions that they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. The freedom to debate and to discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, wherever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the core functioning of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. In a word, the university's commitment is to the principle that debate and deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments, not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation in an effective and responsible manner is an essential part of the university's educational mission. As a corollary to the university's commitment to protect and promote free expression, members of the university must also act in conformity with the principle of free expression. Although members of the university community are free to criticize and contest the views expressed on campus and to criticize and contest speakers who are invited to express their views on campus, they may not obstruct or otherwise interfere with the freedom of others to express views that they reject or even loathe. To this end, the university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. As University of Chicago President William Rennie Harper observed 125 years ago, without a vibrant commitment to free and open inquiry, a university ceases to be a university. End quote. Now, when we wrote this report, we were thinking only about the University of Chicago. Indeed, the first 5 paragraphs of the report, which I didn't touch, all talk about the history of the university itself. To our surprise, the report has since been adopted by a range of other colleges and universities, including such diverse institutions as Princeton, Purdue, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, the University of Minnesota, American University, the University of Wisconsin, and LSU, and is currently under consideration by dozens of other institutions, as well as by several institutions in other nations. What they figured out they could do is lop off the first 5 paragraphs and then just use the core of the report as their own. Okay, so now that I've finished congratulating myself, let me elaborate just a bit. So why should a university take the position that members of the university community should be free to advance any and all ideas, however offensive, obnoxious, and wrong-headed they might be? Well, first, one thing we have learned from bitter experience is that even the ideas that we hold to be most certain might, in fact, turn out to be wrong. As confident as we might be in our own wisdom, and as certain as we might be that the ideas that we loathe are in fact loathsome, experience teaches that certainty is different from truth. As Oliver Wendell Holmes said about the First Amendment almost a century ago, the temptation to suppress opinions that one regards as hateful and fraught with death is perfectly logical. After all, he said, if you have no doubt of your premises, and if you want a certain result with all your heart, then you naturally sweep away all opposition. But, Holmes added, when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by the free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. If those who believed to an absolute certainty that the earth was the center of the universe were wrong, if those who believed with that absolute certainty in creationism were wrong, if those who believed that slavery was natural, right, and proper were wrong, if those who believed that the criticism of a war was seditious were wrong, then why should we have the arrogance to think with certainty that we are right? The only wise approach, as Holmes said, is to acknowledge the risk that our certainties might be wrong as well, and that they must therefore always be open to challenge and question. And this is true not only for a democracy, but also, and perhaps especially, for a university. Second, history teaches that suppression of speech breeds the suppression of speech. If today I am permitted to silence those whose views I find hateful, I have then opened the door to allow others down the road to silence me. The neutral principle of no suppression of ideas protects us all. Those who today would silence those who offend them invite retaliation in the future. Censorship inevitably invites more censorship. And this is especially dangerous in the current situation. For those who argue most vehemently for censorship today are members of minority groups of various stripes whose own vulnerability to being silenced in the future is much greater than they might imagine. This is a door we simply do not want to open. Third, a central precept of free expression is the concern with chilling effect. That is, the tendency of individuals to forego their own expression because of the risk that if they speak openly, they will then later be disadvantaged. This is a special concern in the realm of free expression, because it's almost always the case that Joe knows that if he marches in a parade or signs a petition, nothing of consequence is likely to follow from his act of speech. But if Joe knows that expressing his views in these ways might subject him, now or in the future, to some significant disadvantage, ranging from not getting into graduate school, to not getting a job, to not being able to run later for public office, then he will exercise caution. He will remain silent. And this is what we mean by chilling effect. Now, the problem from the standpoint of free speech is that it probably doesn't matter very much if Joe himself remains silent, given that his voice alone won't make all that much difference in the world. But if lots of Joes remain silent for the same reason, then the marketplace of ideas is distorted and the debate is skewed. If everyone critical of a war is chilled into silence because of the fear of the consequences down the road, then criticism of the war disappears from public discourse. Now, that problem is especially acute today because of the effects of social media. It used to be the case that students or faculty members were generally willing to take controversial positions because the risks to them were relatively modest. If you took an argument, took a position that might offend some people, they might be annoyed at the moment, but it would just go away, and you could have the conversation in a free and robust manner. But in the world of social media, where every comment you make can be circulated to the world and can later be called up by prospective employers or graduate schools or neighbors with the mere click of a button, the potential costs of speaking courageously, of taking controversial positions, is greater than ever before in history. Indeed, according to a recent survey, 65% of all college students now say that it is unsafe for them to express unpopular views. And this clearly has an effect on faculty as well. In this setting, it is especially important for universities to stand up for free expression. So how should this work in practice? Should students be allowed to express whatever views they want, however offensive they might be to others, whether about abortion, affirmative action, homosexuality, immigration, Israel, Black Lives Matter, or the like? Yes, absolutely. Sorry. Should those who disagree and who are offended by the views and speech of others be allowed to condemn that speech and those speakers in the most vehement terms? Yes, absolutely. Should those who are offended and who disagree be allowed to demand that the university punish those who have offended them? Yes, absolutely. Should the university punish those whose speech offends and annoys others? Absolutely not. That is the core meaning of academic freedom. Should students and faculty and community members who oppose a speaker be permitted to disrupt an event to prevent the individual from speaking? Absolutely not. Although non-disruptive protest and criticism are both permitted and indeed robustly encouraged, the disruption of such an event is directly incompatible with the central principle of free speech. It is no more acceptable to disrupt a speaker in order to shut her down than it is to break into a library to burn books or to shout down a discussion in a classroom. Such behavior is intolerable in a community dedicated to the free and open expression of competing ideas. But what should a university do? A university should educate its students and faculty about the importance of civility and mutual respect. These are core values for students, for professors, and for citizens. But these are values that should be reinforced by education and by example, not by censorship. Moreover, a university should encourage free, open, and robust disagreement, argument, and debate. It should instill in its students and faculty the importance of winning the day by facts, by ideas, and by persuasion, rather than by force, by disruption, or by censorship. The bottom line is this: for a university to fulfill its most fundamental mission, it must be a safe space for even the most loathsome, odious, offensive, and disloyal arguments. Students should be encouraged to be tough, fearless, rigorous, and effective advocates and critics. Now, at the same time, though, a university has to recognize that our society, being flawed as it is, the cost of free speech will often fall most heavily on those groups and individuals who feel the most marginalized, unwelcome, and disrespected. All of us, of course, feel that way sometimes, but in our often unjust society, the individuals who most often bear the brunt of free speech, or of at least certain types of free speech, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, immigrants, ideological dissidents, and the like. Universities must be sensitive to this reality. Even if they cannot solve this problem by censorship, this does not mean that they cannot take other steps to address the special challenges faced by groups and individuals who are most often made to feel unwelcome and unvalued by others. Universities should take this challenge seriously. They should encourage civility and mutual respect. They should support students who feel vulnerable, marginalized, silenced, and demeaned. They should help those students learn how to speak up, how to respond effectively, how to challenge those whose attitudes, whose words, and whose beliefs offend, appall, and outrage them. This is a core responsibility of universities, for the world is not a safe space, and it is our job to enable our graduates to win the battles that they will need to fight in the years and in the decades to come. This is not a challenge the university should ignore. And let me on that point say a word about the letter that Svetlana mentioned, sent by the Dean of Students, Jay Ellison, to our entering college students, because it received a lot of media attention. And the line, some of you may have been aware of this, but the line in the letter that Ellison wrote that caused all of the controversy essentially said that the university disapproves of trigger warnings and safe spaces. I have to say this was an erroneous statement by the Dean of Students. He meant well, I have no doubt, but had he asked people who were more involved in thinking about these issues, he would have written the statement somewhat differently. So let me explain what I think is the appropriate position of a university on those two issues. So a trigger warning, as I said, is a statement, either oral or written, by a professor at some point during a course that alerts certain students, or all students, that they will encounter some material that they may find especially difficult, painful, and emotionally problematic. The right approach on that issue is the approach that almost all universities and colleges have, and it's the approach the University of Chicago has, which is that the decision to give such trigger warnings is a matter of academic freedom to the individual faculty member. Some faculty members may choose to do this, some faculty members may choose not to do this, and that's part of their academic freedom as professors in how they choose to teach their own class. My own view about this is that it is appropriate to do this. Now, I have to say I've never had occasion in over 40 years of teaching to give a trigger warning. Part of the reason for that is that the claimed need for it is largely exaggerated. We all teach with syllabi. Our students have a pretty good idea when we're going to talk about rape in a criminal law class or when we're going to talk about affirmative action in a constitutional law class. You don't need to alert them. It's in the syllabus, right? But sometimes it's not so obvious. In a literature class, for example, it may be that some novel, which is not revealed by the title to the novel, will have scenes in it about, say, sexual assault or whatever that might be very explicit, and to someone who has been sexually assaulted in recent weeks or months and is in counseling, it might actually be a very painful thing. In my view, if a student comes to me at the beginning of a class and says, I really am very sensitive to certain issues, will you do me a favor and let me know when that will be, if it will be encountered in the material, I'd have no problem doing that. And if a student said to me, I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't call on me on the day when we're discussing it, I'd have no problem with that. I'd call on her or him the day before or the day after on a different topic. But I think that's an acceptable, reasonable thing to do. So I think that what was said in the letter was really not an accurate reflection of the practice and the policies of the university. Similarly, on the safe space issue, the university, like other universities, has well over 100 student organizations that exist for African American students, for Latino students, for gay students, for Jewish students, for Catholic students, for atheist students, basically for any conceivable group of students. And the purpose of those organizations is to enable them to work together, to talk together, to invite speakers, to discuss their own experiences themselves, to take positions with the institution, and to be a safe place for students who share that set of experiences and backgrounds and ideas, to do that in a way that isn't intruded upon by outsiders. And that's always been true in universities, and I think that's the case at every university I've ever known of. And those kinds of safe spaces, I think, are perfectly appropriate and uncontroversial. And I think what was said in Ellison's letter implied something beyond that, and that's actually not an accurate reflection. So that's just to clarify a bit about those two issues. So as a good law professor, let me leave you with a few hypothetical situations that, if you like, we can discuss in the question and answer session. Here are 4 examples. First, suppose a professor gives a talk on campus invited by a student group in which he argues that affirmative action is immoral and should be banned because it puts its intended beneficiaries into an academic environment for which they are unprepared and does them a disservice. Minority students are furious because the talk, they say, demeans them and, in their view, is blatantly racist. The question is what the president of the university should do in the face of such complaints. Second, suppose a student hangs a Confederate flag, a swastika, an image of an aborted fetus, or a Vote for Trump sign on the door to his dorm room in a residence hall. Should the resident head order her to take it down if other students object, saying, I do not want to leave my room every day and see that thing in front of me? Third, suppose a faculty member uses the word fuck in class, or uses the word slut, or the word nigger. Students are furious. As president of the university, what should you do? Fourth, suppose the dean of the law school goes on Fox News and says on national television, abortion is murder. We should fire any woman faculty member and expel any woman student who has an abortion. The president of the university is then inundated with complaints from alumni saying, in effect, I'll never give another nickel to your damn school as long as she remains dean of your law school. and also receives letters from admitted students saying they will not attend the school if it permits such a person to hold a position of leadership. Faced with that, what should the president of the university do? Okay, that's enough for now. Happy to take questions and comments.
My question is, how has the University of Chicago letter been received by such alleged traditional enemies of campus free speech? For example, as the Black Lives Matter movement, apologists for radical Islam, defenders of Pol Pot, Mao, and Stalin, transgender right advocates, Holocaust revisionists, 9/11 conspiracy theorists, radical gender feminists, etc.
You have to tick through all of those.
So the letter, when Jay Ellison wrote the letter, it was a letter to the entering college students. And I have no doubt that he didn't intend it to be controversial, didn't realize it was going to be controversial, and was completely blindsided by the response. Yet it was a kind of media explosion. I found myself on 6 different radio shows and several TV shows, mainly because I was the author of the university statement and because everybody else was hiding. So it was made into a pretty big deal. And people reacted, as far as I can tell, in a very bifurcated way. There were those who latched on to the particular sentence with the references, the trigger warnings and safe spaces, and were outraged and were extremely critical of the university for being insensitive to the situations of sensitive, legitimately concerned students, and that what was being boasted was something that was not to be proud of. There were many others who flooded the university with congratulations, not, I think, also understanding the letter. I mean, and thinking this was wonderful, but I think probably not really knowing what a trigger warning was or what safe space was and so on. So there was a very bifurcated and very substantial set of responses. I mean, I don't know what the president's office received, but even I probably received at least 100 emails on both sides of the issue. The truth is, it was a fuss about that should never have happened because the statement did not reflect what the university's actual policy is. And I think at this point it's largely died down. And I actually was asked to give a speech on Thursday evening to all of the entering college students. This was organized long before the Ellison letter. But the university has what's called an Aims of Education address, in which each year all of the entering college students come together in the university's Rockefeller Chapel, and a member of the faculty gives them a 45-minute talk explaining what they should be thinking about how they approach their education over the next 4 years. So I was asked to give that talk, again, several months before the Ellison letter came into existence. But what I talked about was the same kind of thing I talked about today, but obviously longer. And the students it was interesting, the response of the students seemed to be very positive to it. And it's hard to tell whether that's the case or not, but it seemed to be very positive. So even though there are no doubt lots of students in the entering class who share the perspective of the students who demand protection, even they seem to be proud of what the university stands for, particularly because I clarified what I said earlier about the Ellison letter. So,
Professor Stone, thank you very much for being here. I am thankful for your logic and reason. Question, what advice do you have, if any, for the president of Northwestern University after saying, and I quote, people who criticize safe spaces, quote, drive me nuts, unquote. What would you do if you were in his position, and what do you make about the two predominant universities in Chicago, the University of Chicago and Northwestern, taking such different and controversial opinions on this issue?
well, again, I don't think the University of Chicago and Northwestern on the safe space issue actually take different positions. The Northwestern's problem is that they have been the target of a lot of criticism. justifiably, in my view. I mentioned one example of it in my talk involving the Chronicle of Our Education issue, but there are quite a few other issues where I think Northwestern has behaved badly in terms of academic freedom. There's one instance where they dismissed a untenured faculty member because she basically insisted on the journal that she edited being free to exercise academic freedom when the relevant dean didn't want her doing so because he was afraid it would alienate donors. And there are other instances like that as well. So I think Morty Shapiro at Northwestern has been very defensive about these issues. And in this instance, I think it led him to a kind of off-the-charts comment, which was really directed at the University of Chicago because of the Ellison letter. That's what that comment was about. And I think it was mainly defensive on his part and trying to exploit the controversy that Chicago was going through in order to say, you know, look at us, we protect our students, and Chicago is just crazy. They don't care about their students at all. So that's what I think about it.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I would. It seems the marketplace of ideas, you mentioned that, seems to be important, and my question is, how do you think the power relationship between the student body, those who, especially those who feel threatened by certain topics, is, and how that affect between the students and the teachers, between the administration and the student body? How do you think that power relationship affects free speech? Because they make the decision on ultimately who talks, who doesn't, and stuff like that.
So a couple of responses. First, I think that university administrators and professors, including myself, are getting educated about these attitudes on the part of students, which didn't exist 5 years ago. And there are several challenges involved in that. One of them is understanding the degree of sensitivity that exists in the students today and trying to figure out, as educators, how to deal with that in a productive manner. In terms of the power relationship, it's actually kind of perverse because I think universities do not want to be seen as inhospitable to their minority students, their women students, their gay students, and so on. That's not a place where they want to be in terms of public relations these days. And therefore, the students, interestingly, have more power in this regard than they should. That's why universities have been caving on these issues. It's not because the deans and the professors are persuaded that this is, in the abstract, the right thing to do. They know withdrawing a speaker invitation is not the right thing to do. Right? They know that defunding a school newspaper because other students complain is not the right thing to do. They know that. But they're doing it anyway because they're afraid of bad publicity. And the bad publicity now is worse if you're perceived as being unsympathetic than if you're perceived as being committed to academic freedom. And that's a real challenge for these institutions right now.
Thank you. I know it's very early in the semester, but I'm just wondering if there have been any occurrences on campus that pertain to this new policy.
Well, Chicago is a quarter system, so our first day of classes is Monday, tomorrow. So, yeah, so we have not had an opportunity yet this year for any of those issues. We have had two situations in the last 2 years that did arise and that were problematic. They both involved speakers who were invited to come to the university and whose presence triggered an opposition by community members as well as some students. One was Anita Alvarez, who was the state's attorney, the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, which David Axelrod runs, invited all of the candidates for state's attorney to come and talk to students and faculty at the Institute of Politics. And when Anita Alvarez came, there was a group of a handful, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 10 community members and some students who basically got up and shouted and disrupted and continued to do so until the event had to be effectively canceled. And then there was another event involving a Palestinian who is actually critical of the Palestinian position on the dispute about Israel and Palestine, who was apparently fairly well known for this, and he came, and there were members of the BDS movement who came and similarly disrupted the event. And the event also was terminated. And it poses a really complicated problem for universities, because that behavior is clearly unacceptable. I don't think anyone in the university positions of authority believes that that's acceptable. There are students and community members who believe that it is acceptable to do this because they feel that they are otherwise powerless to be heard. And this is a way of getting their message across, by shutting down other speakers. That is not acceptable. But the problem is, what do you do about it? Right? So one thing you can do is call in the police, university security, and real police, and drag people out physically in the middle of an event. And because community members are involved in some of these, it's particularly problematic because they're not even students. But that's ugly, right? And you clearly don't feel comfortable doing that. That's not something a university wants to have to do. The other thing you can do is to basically make clear that students who behave in this way will be disciplined, right? But there's two weaknesses with that. One of them is, how do you know who the students are? Right? You have somebody go and take pictures of them all while they're doing this, and you hope that they'll be deterred from doing this by the fact that they will be disciplined. And the other problem is that doesn't affect community members, because they don't give a damn. They're not subject to university discipline. So this poses a real dilemma that I think even we are trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with it. Accepting it is unacceptable. And there's actually a committee that's been appointed to try to figure out exactly how to deal with this particular issue. So those are the only two incidents we've had in the last couple of years that fit within this domain.
Hi. I teach at DePaul, and I was aware of that situation. And unlike the University of Chicago, DePaul seems to have started to react just in the opposite way. So every day I get emails about diversity and inclusion, and I teach writing, and in our fall meeting, someone from the Anti-Defamation League was invited to teach us how to teach diversity in our classrooms. So the ramifications of that speech have really upset DePaul. I don't know if it's just those Vincentians, but have you heard anything about the ramifications at DePaul from Milo's aborted speech?
I read all about it, obviously, in the media. I don't think I know anything more than you do about it. Again, it was a controversial speaker, and the speech was shut down. And the university president initially made a pretty good statement about that we should not be doing this, but then there was a wave of criticism. And as I said earlier, universities are very vulnerable right now to being accused of being unsympathetic to these complaints. And DePaul has therefore kind of caved in exactly the way I said earlier, and the way most institutions have, in this context. And this is why Chicago has, at least in its public presentation of itself, been so distinctive, is because we've made clear we're not going to cave, although we did have these two event situations, which we didn't quite know exactly how to handle. But we didn't afterwards say it's okay to disrupt an event. I think DePaul is wrestling with this issue, and I'm sympathetic to the dilemma, because I do understand. Here's the problem for universities. U.S. News and World Report is enormously, unfortunately, powerful in terms of how universities lead themselves these days. U.S. News and World Report ranks these institutions in ways that are largely ridiculous, but they have a great impact on prospective students in deciding which schools they will go to. They look at these rankings and they say, I'm not going to go to number 36 if I get into number 24. Alumni get upset if the school goes down. And donors often, as alumni and others, get upset. Even faculty members, if you're trying to hire somebody on the faculty, they look at it and they say, well, I don't know if I want to go to number 36 if I can also teach at number 23. So institutions are very sensitive to this. And U.S. News gives a great deal of weight to yield, to what percentage of the students you admit come. And universities are very nervous about bad publicity, leading students to say, well, I don't want to go there. It's a lousy place because they're not sympathetic to minorities and so on. And so this is the key factor, I think, in driving universities to act in ways that are against their values. And this is not an unusual example about U.S. News having this effect. It happens all over the place. But I do think that's the connection. Universities don't want bad publicity about this, not because alumni will be upset. Most alumni are actually sympathetic to academic freedom. It's the high school students, and then through U.S. News. So it's crazy. But that's the dynamic by which these things happen, and that's why what you're seeing happen at DePaul.
Yes.
Thank you. So I have a question about the civility and disagreements, and it seems like the previous wave of lack of civility was in the 60s probably.
Which what? I'm sorry.
In 1960s, and there were a lot of violence and disagreements, and it seems like it's coming back again. You know, it's not. Most reasonable people agree that people should disagree. That's what students go to colleges for, find different ideas and try to contemplate those ideas and discuss it. But lack of civility and threats that seems to be on the rise, and that's what I thought. My question is, what do you think about that?
So I actually think the degree of civility in terms of explicit statements that are racist or homophobic or insulting to women or whatever, in the context of the campus life, have almost disappeared relative to my experience 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, they were never very common, frankly, but I think they've gotten much less common. What has changed dramatically is, again, social media. 20 years ago, a student at a place like the University of Chicago or DePaul or whatever would see very little truly hateful speech. They would encounter it almost never. Yeah, there may be, moments in a fraternity where people would say something or whatever, but it was not visible on a day-to-day basis. Social media has changed that dramatically. What students and others, of course, see on social media is a huge amount of hateful speech. And I think that has made this generation of students more sensitive. You might think it may inure them to it. Let's say, this is ridiculous. But I think, in fact, it's made them more sensitive to it in a good way. But I don't think that you actually see very much serious incivility on university campuses. I mean, there's occasional instances that they wind up in the newspapers and so on, and but it's pretty rare. And what's called incivility today, so there's a party where a bunch of students, wear sombreros in a costume party, and that's insulting to certain other students or whatever. But that's the kind of incivility you see. It's not anything that's really gross and harsh in the way it used to be. So I don't think that exists, except for the sensitivities now that have gotten so much more sensitive to things. So the microaggression concept, right? Using words like lynch, I can understand. Once my consciousness is raised by that, I guess I can understand why that might upset people. I didn't grow up being told that word was something you never used. Nobody ever thought of it that way in the past. But there's been this heightened sensitivity, which means there are new phrases, new words that are treated as insensitive. But fundamentally, I think things are much more civil than they ever were before on this perspective. But the standards of civility have changed. People are offended by things that never would have been thought of as offensive before.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and speaking with us. Maybe to follow up on that is, and specific question that I have is there a line at all, even in the 4 examples you gave at the end, it seems to me that all of them could be answered with the rule that you've suggested of allowing free speech, but there is some sort of speech that would be unacceptable. You didn't give any examples of those in your 4 examples, and I believe the Supreme Court does not say free speech is absolute. And the universities may believe that it is absolute, but it would be easy to come up with examples that would not be acceptable. But those don't seem to be addressed, and that sort of goes to the question of civility. If somebody does come as a guest speaker, perhaps, not a sombrero party, but a guest speaker who's maintaining a position to incite violence, is there any point that the university says that speech is unacceptable? And if there is a line that has to be drawn, because that's what I'm suggesting that there is, but you just haven't addressed it, then where is it?
Okay, so first of all, I gave a series of explicit examples in the talk about speech that violates the law, about defamation, about invasions of privacy, about threats, about harassment. Those are all situations where the university can and would restrict speech. And I also gave the one at the end of that list about speech that directly interferes with the core functioning of the university. Now, in the hypotheticals I gave, I actually believe 3 of the 4 are really hard cases. The first one, if you recall, is the professor saying these things about affirmative action, which is offensive to minority students and so on. I think the answer to that, that's within the domain of academic freedom, clearly. But on the others, I think it's less clear. So, in a residence hall, can an institution regulate signs on the doors that people will see every day when they get up and when they walk down to have breakfast and when they come in the evening and so on? I don't think a university can pick and choose which signs to allow and which not. And one of the reasons they gave all those examples is to demonstrate how complicated it is to try to choose, well, is the Confederate flag not okay and the swastika not okay, but the Trump sign is okay, and what's the difference and why is it okay? But I think a university could say no signs on the doors of a residence hall as a flat rule. And because that wouldn't be picking on particular points of view, and it would be a genuine, simple rule. In the example of the dean making the statement about abortion being murder and no faculty member, no student should be allowed to be there, a dean is different from a student or faculty member. A dean is speaking as the agent of the university in a particular way. And a dean has a specific and defined responsibility to raise funds. And that's part of a dean's job. Absolutely it is. And a dean who behaves in a way that makes it impossible to be effective in doing that, I think can be removed from her job. So that's an example of where I would say that you can regulate the speech, because that does interfere with the core functioning of the university, given the particular responsibility of that individual. I forget what my 4th example was. What was it? Oh, right, the words in class. So there I would say, if the words are relevant to the material being discussed, you can, of course, use them. Absolutely. But a professor is using those words, particularly racial or other epithets, then there's a question about professionalism in the classroom. And if a professor starts calling students those names, how could you say that, you spick? Right? That's not professionalism. That can absolutely be regulated. So the hypotheticals were meant not to be easy cases. They were meant to actually be serious issues. Oh, you decide, yes.
I'll move over to that side. I know I've been privileging the left.
Well, it's the right from my standpoint. So.
My question was more or less along the lines of what the gentleman here had to say. You mentioned how should a university react if they put up a Confederate flag or a swastika on the door. Where's the line between allowing freedom of speech but also perhaps tolerating hatred? Doesn't all hatred against groups start with speech?
So the answer to that is that hatred expressed in words is protected speech. We may not like it. Lots of speech offends different people in different ways. Many countries have banned what's called hate speech. Right? The United States has not. The Supreme Court has said it would be unconstitutional to do that. That hatred of groups is something that is an idea. People believe it. People sincerely think it's correct. and it should be debated and challenged and discussed. And the view I would take is that you can't separate that out from other ideas that other people may loathe. People loathe the idea of creationism. People loathe the idea of socialism. In my view, this is no different. You and I may hate that speech, and we don't care about creationism. We don't care about other speech. But in my view, it's an idea that has to be responded to and addressed, and it can't be stifled. That's not going to improve society, in fact.
Over here, where does Barney fit into the equation?
Where does what fit?
Where does Barney, the purple dinosaur with the millenniums, fit into this equation?
You got to explain that to me. Sorry. What does that mean?
Oh, maybe is your question whether any of these, whether any calls for censorship come from the political right? I think most of the examples that you've provided, I'm translating here, most of the examples you provided are coming from the left of the political spectrum. Are there instances on the right?
So one of the things that's fascinating about the current moment is that historically, every major move for censorship came from the right. Right? Whether you go back to the religious issues, the creationism issues, the corporate philanthropists who tended to be more conservative, criticizing liberal professors, anti-war during World War I, the communism era, and so on, the Vietnam era. It's basically always been the right. It has been the advocate for censorship. But sexual expression, it's been the right. This is the first time I can think of in American history when the movement for censorship has come primarily from the left. And the reason it's happened on the left in this context is the left, loosely defined, is deeply committed to two competing values here. One of them is free speech, and the other one is the fairness and equity and equality to groups that have been historically discriminated against and oppressed. I mean, the left are also the champions of anti-discrimination laws and so on. And so here there's a direct conflict in the values that have defined liberalism in the United States. And so the left is divided on these issues. You have those like myself who believe that free speech here should be the dominant value, and you have others who are equally committed as being liberals who believe, no, this is a situation where hate speech is involved, where the interest of protecting minorities and others trumps, so to speak, free speech. It's annoying to me, frankly, that this is a moment when the right is able to be right. And it is true that you find, the Wall Street Journal writing op-eds and editorials, celebrating the University of Chicago statement, celebrating free speech as if they've always been for free speech, which of course they haven't. And William Buckley and George Will, and so it's a little weird. But I think that this is a context in which conservatives have embraced the free speech principle in a way they haven't traditionally.
Hi. I don't know if you distinguished or if Ellison's letter distinguishes between on and off-campus behavior. And in terms of social media, I see, especially at, where the frontal cortex is not fully matured with junior high and senior high school students, speech occurring off campus, not during school day. Does Ellison's letter address speech that occurs off campus?
His letter was several paragraphs. It wasn't saying anything complicated, so it doesn't address that at all. It is an interesting question about, to what extent a university has a legitimate interest in disciplining students for behavior that they engage in outside of the university. And the definition of outside is complicated, particularly in a world of social media, right? So it used to be the case before social media that universities would be reluctant to discipline students for activity outside the four corners of the campus, but not always. So if you had, for example, a sexual assault committed by one student against another in a private apartment, the university would act on that because it was one student against another, even though it wasn't literally on the campus. So there's always been a little bit of ambiguity about the boundaries in that situation. But basically, universities try not to deal with issues that are not directly implicating the institution itself. But how you define that is a little vague. So there's no simple answer to the question. As I say, if a student puts on social media something which a university would define as hate speech that was prohibited by that university, I don't think they would care very much if it was seen by other students and affected their behavior on campus. We wouldn't do that at all just because we wouldn't punish it, but other universities would find that difficult. And there is not a simple answer. The fact is that the geography of campus is not always clean.
Do you think that the position that a university takes on free speech could influence its students as they go into the marketplace, as they get jobs in corporations and such, and affect whether they are going to be willing to speak up in unethical situations that come up within those corporations or organizations?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I mean, my view as an educator is that a part of what our mission is to enable our graduates to be effective and responsible people in the real world. And it's not our job to inculcate our students with certain policy beliefs. It's to educate them to how to think about policy beliefs from all perspectives. But in doing so, in encouraging them to be fearless and to argue and to respond and to win on the battlefield of ideas, our hope is that we are empowering them as citizens to behave in that way for the rest of their lives. And I think that's part of what a mission of a university should be.
Right here.
So I'm curious whether there are guidelines given to scholars about how to present information to the students. I'm thinking about the fact that when scholars want to get published, whether it be a book or an op-ed, they often have to take a strong opinion on something. Yet, if your student is in an Econ 101 class or History 101 class, Poli-Sci 101, with someone who's either been clearly to the left or to the right as an arch conservative, how well equipped are they then to present accurate information and is it expected that they should be conveying their topic in an unbiased way, or is the university just fine with their perspective coming through in everything that's taught in that class? I'm not sure if I'm being clear.
Yeah, we're perfectly
what
clear.
I'm saying.
So the question is, should a professor attempt to inculcate her students with her own perspective of a particular issue? Or should she present the student with a range of different perspectives, including ones that she herself doesn't agree with, in order to encourage them to think it through for themselves?
Does the university have a policy to try to tell the scholars that we expect that you will present information in a range?
So the university actually does have a formal statement about teaching, which says exactly this. I don't know how many faculty members are even aware of it, frankly, but it does have a statement to that effect. And I think that is deeply built into the culture of the University of Chicago, that we understand that our job is not to inculcate students with our own views. And there may be outliers who do that, but they would not be regarded as meeting their educational responsibilities. And we spend much of our time arguing with one another, because that's the way you think through your own ideas better. And so when I teach a First Amendment class, for example, on free speech, I am very clear in my own mind that I will get the students to argue all sides of all issues. And they may know who I am, and they do know who I am, and they do know what my own views about these things are, because they've read what I've written and so on. But within the classroom, they understand that they're expected to see the issues from all sides and to argue them from all sides. So I think that is the goal. Are faculty taught to do that? I don't think we do that explicitly. It may be that there's lots of conversations that go on about teaching, but I don't think there's sort of an explicit teaching of how to teach in that respect. There's now, as you mentioned earlier about DePaul, there's now in universities around the country an increasing step towards teaching people about how to teach, about inclusion and diversity, and how to be sensitive to students. I don't think we've done that yet at Chicago. I'm not aware of that. But I do think people are sensitive, faculty and institutions are sensitive to it. They don't want faculty members inadvertently and unintentionally saying things that will cause issues that the faculty member doesn't mean to cause. And I'm ambivalent about that. I mean, my sense is, in theory, it's not a bad idea, but you want to do it in a very soft way, not a hard way. I mean, I would like to know, for example, if there are things that I am inadvertently saying that are truly disturbing to students in ways that I wouldn't realize. So I was raised to know that there are certain things you didn't say. Certain words were bad words, right? And I would not use those words in a classroom unless they were directly relevant to what I was teaching, right? And if that evolves over time, if what I learned 55, 60 years ago is obsolete, if there are now lots of other words that have come to be understood as similarly offensive and inappropriate, I'd like to know that, right? I don't want to be stuck in the world of 1950 without being aware of the fact that other words have now been added to that list that I don't know about. So I'd like to know that, but I don't want anybody to tell me what I can do or can't do in the classroom.
You spoke earlier about the multiplicity of organizations, especially at the University of Chicago campus.
I think it's true everywhere.
I think you said something like 100 or more.
Right.
To meet every need on campus, every students on campus. I'd like you to, so far we've been talking about the right of free speech, an exchange of ideas, argument, and all that. To what extent, and one of the rejoinders in this faculty letter that criticized Allison's statement was his remark about safe space. And so that's almost a different issue. How sensitive or encouraging should universities be in establishing safe spaces for students who have special needs? It could be disabled, it could be PTSD survivors, it could be survivors of rape, survivors, particularly in the black community, of being raised as second class to the rest. How important is this whole idea of safe space and the question of trigger warnings?
Well, on the safe space issue, one of the problems is the definition. Nobody really knows what one means by a safe space, right? In talking about student clubs and organizations, that is a form of a safe space, right? If the word is to mean a physical space set aside by the university only for students of a certain identity, that's much more problematic. Now, we do have those. The first of those, to my knowledge, was about 25 years ago, and it was for gay students at a time when there were many students who were gay but were not out. And they wanted an opportunity related to a counseling center to meet with other students who were gay or who were gay and not out, and gay who were out, to talk among themselves in private to try to figure out the dilemma that they faced. And so I know Chicago created such a place. Now, again, it wasn't a place. It wasn't a physical place reserved for them. It was a part of the counseling center where they would have meetings on a regular basis. And there are rape counseling centers that exist and so on. But I think the problem with starting to do it broadly on an identity basis is then you have to figure out who gets it and who doesn't get it, right? And that's not a road I think I would be very comfortable with. So if African American students want their particular center, then Asian American students might want it, and Jewish students may want it, and gay students may want it, and students who don't like economics may want it. And before you know it, you've got to decide, yes, you get it, no, you don't get it. And the other thing is, I'm not very comfortable with the idea of students being able to say, you can't come into our states. We don't think you're black, right? We don't think you're Jewish enough. We don't think you're gay enough, right? That's not a comfortable situation to invite. So I'm much more comfortable with the idea of these student organizations than I am with the university directly creating physical spaces where you need to have a ticket to get in, and the university decides what groups get them, what groups don't get them, and so on. So that does make me very nervous. But there are some of them. There are certainly some of them, like in the early years of the gays, where I think it was completely justified. And I think rape victims, there's a similar need for sort of a counseling group type thing. But that's different from the physical space that says blacks only, right, or gays only.
Well, we could go on, and fortunately, Professor Stone is willing to continue the conversation outside, but I do have to do some housekeeping, so this was our last question. Thank you.
Thank you.